Okay, guys. So we were saying that in 1864, the Prussians and Austrians, who were not the best friends at this point, but both still considered to be in the German Confederation, and with interests in holding on to and expanding the German Confederation, went into Denmark as King Christian attempted to consolidate his control over the traditionally Danish areas of Schleswig and Holstein. So when the Prussians and Austrians wrested control of these two areas away from the Danes, one of the immediate fights was who's going to control what. And I think when our video paused, I was just about to talk about something that everyone knew that Bismarck wanted. And that is right here. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can probably zoom in on it when you're looking at this. And that is the port of Kiel. The assumption was that Schleswig would be a Protestant-controlled area and that Holstein would be a Catholic-controlled area. That was the majority religion of the people there, and of course, holding to that German rule of religion of the ruler. The Protestants, it made sense for them to administer Schleswig, and the Catholic Austrians wanted Holstein. But this port of Kiel area was very key for Bismarck. And so depending on your historical view of Bismarck, he might have gone into this war with Denmark on the side of the Austrians because that was the right thing to do for these Germanic lands, or he did it because he always planned on using this as a wedge to get the Prussians upset with the Austrians and to cause more Prussian nationalism. So I thought it was interesting that I found this article in the New York Times in 1865, where the New York Times is writing about their view of what was really going on in Schleswig-Holstein. And so I'll just read that to you real quickly. It says, each of these powers entered into the war against Denmark with the full intention of cheating each other and pocketing the lion's share of the spoils. No sane man out of Germany ever believed that the crusade against the little mother kingdom was begun for the purpose of delivering the Schleswig-Holsteiners from Danish rule. Everybody knew that Prussia had an eye on Kiel as a commodious harbor for her prospective navy. Austria wanted another ally among the small German states that support her against Prussia and assist in checkmating the ambitious designs of King Wilhelm and Herr Bismarck. The people at large supported the war from a vague notice that it might lead to grand results in the way of German unity, that unfulfilled dream of many centuries. With the conclusion of peace came bitter jealousies, accusations, recriminations. The threatened to set all Germany together by the ears, Prussia, having the most to gain, made the first dash for the spoils. She seized upon the important seaport of Kiel and commenced there the erection of fortifications and dockyards with the aid of a person that felt entirely at home and meant to stay. When Austria remonstrated, Count Bismarck serenely smiled and uttered a few glittering generalities about the glory of Prussia being inseparably entwined with that of all the German states. Like a prudent statesman, he is content to move slowly, occasionally throwing a little dust into his adversary's eyes. He still keeps up a show of negotiation with Austria and the Federal Diet, and even proposes to allow the people of Schleswig-Holstein to express their sentiments through an election which he knows well will do them no possible good, nor stand in the way of the accomplishment of his own designs. So the New York Times takes a pretty cynical view of Bismarck's original intentions. No matter what, this certainly stirred Prussian nationalism, and it stirred the feelings of a pro-Germanic dominance in Europe. So the relationship, however, with Austria was extremely strained at this point, and it was only a matter of time until the Austrians and the Prussians would come to war. So what will unite Prussia and the Northern Germans? A war with Austria would certainly help to bring that about. And there had been, like we said, this long-standing tension between the Austrians and the Germans, jealousy over Austria's lack of participation in the Zollverein, rival between a new power and an old power. Austria once being one of the greatest powers in the cultural center of Europe, Prussia always being kind of an underdog, but having this mighty military. Now we would have, in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, we would actually have a contest, excuse me, of one of the largest armies in Europe and one of the oldest and most respected armies in Europe. So Prussia is going to have about 720,000 men under arms. One of the reasons that they have so many is because of their requirement for all able-bodied men to serve in the military. Austria has about 600,000 men, but their army has far more experience, hundreds of years of experience and proven efforts on the battlefield. And so who's going to win out in a war against with the Austrians and the Prussians? Well, let's talk about exactly what happened. First of all, we call the Austro-Prussian War, which happened in 1866, a cabinet war, Kabinetskrieg. It means a war of just a small amount of countries. And this war is not going to expand to involve other nations or to involve other forces allying. It's more a war of selected people fighting each other, and the only agreement in nations is for other nations to stay out and not come to the other's aid. So the Austro-Prussian War happened in 1866. We cannot talk a ton about the Austro-Prussian or Franco-Prussian Wars, but what I have here on the slide is extremely important for you to know about, okay? First of all, in this cabinet war, the Prussians were victorious almost at the very beginning. The battle is known as Sadova, and it was the major battle of the war and the decisive victory for the Prussians. Once the Prussians beat the Austrians at this battle, it was like the rest of the war was just a wrap-up, just a conclusion. Why was it so incredibly lopsided when you had this Austrian Empire that had been a viable military force for years? For that answer, we want to look at the advantages. So first of all, most people would say that the Prussians had a far better mobilization plan than the Austrians. So let's talk about what we mean by mobilization. When you talk about mobilizing for a war effort, remember in your U.S. history class, you talked about U.S. mobilization, and you talked about things like factories getting online to produce tanks or to produce airplanes. And so mobilizing is a getting readiness. In Europe, we're going to need to talk about the mobilization of armies in the fact that they get ready and that they move to the battlefield lines or move to the borders for protection, move toward capitals. Wherever the armies are moving, that's their mobilization effort. Mobilization is going to be a big factor when we talk about who gets the blame for World War I. So kind of take that, stick it in your back pocket if you don't know what I'm talking about. And we'll address it later. But mobilization plans, how fast can you get your army up, ready, and moving to get them where you need to be? Well, the Prussians had great mobilization plans, and they could get to where they needed to go faster and more efficiently than the Austrians. And this is mostly put down to the work of a Prussian military genius named von Moltke. He was a long-term general, and he had been working on mobilization plans and military plans for Prussia for many, many years. He and Bismarck worked together to move this Prussian war machine. So a better mobilization plan, the Austrians took many more weeks to get their armies to up and running, and that meant that when the Prussians engaged at Sadova, that the Austrian armies weren't even all there at the time that the battle started. Second, Prussia had a requirement, like we said, for all able-bodied men to serve. There were two armies that you could serve in. One is more like a military reserve for older men, and one is more of the active military, that Prussian military that we talked about, where Prussian nobles served as officers. Nonetheless, there was a military mindset in Prussia, and even the reserve force could be activated in time of war, and it was here. That actually, the requirement for military service for all able-bodied men, it was one of the things that the classical liberals did not want to be true, and they were fighting against this military requirement because they thought of it as an old conservative way of doing things, and it didn't respect people's individual rights, and it didn't allow people to make those choices. It just said, well, you're serving the king, and that's what you do. Interestingly enough, it was very helpful for them in this particular circumstance when they need to fight the Danes and then 2 years to fight the Austrians. Third, probably the most important, second most important, is the use of rail. So the Germans, if you remember when we compared back on those Industrial Revolution benefits charts and how much industrialization is benefiting and helping in certain areas, certainly the Germans were up very high on the industrialization chart, and that included the use of rail, the building of rail lines throughout Prussia. And so this rail allowed them to move their troops much faster. When you watch the video on the Austro-Prussian War, you're going to read about how the Prussians came to observe the U.S. military in the U.S. Civil War, and they saw the use of rail for moving troops to battlefields. You're starting to see that for the first time in 1861, 1862 in the United States, and you're going to see it in Prussia and in Austria to a lesser degree during this war. Last is the breech-loading needle gun. Okay, the breech-loading needle gun. So, of course, the old style weapon of choice, and this was the style weapon that the Austrian armies still had, required you to load the weapon from the top. And so whenever you want to load a weapon, you have to empty powder into the gun. You have to then load your ammunition, tamp it down, and then fire. So what this requires is that every time the weapon needs to be reloaded, the soldier must stand or at least kneel in order to load the gun. Now, when everyone has that type of weapon, all things are equal. The breech-loading needle gun, the reason why it's so incredibly a deal breaker for the Prussians is because it loads from the breech. So imagine that the weapon, right, breaks open at the point where the butt of the gun meets the muzzle. Break open the gun at the breech, load, and snap it back shut. That can be done from a position of sitting. It can be done even from a position of lying down. Now we'll get to that in a second. The reason why it's called a needle gun is because a needle pierced the gunpowder pack, and that allowed the weapon to fire. So no more need to tamp down and to make all these preparations. The breech-loading needle gun gave the Prussians a huge advantage in the war. They had adapted these guns and paid a lot of money to distribute breech-loading needle guns to all military personnel. And the Austrians had decided not to adopt that, but to stay with their old rifles. And this made a huge difference. Now, many people even that had a chance to get a breech-loading needle gun on the Austrian side claimed that they would never use it. One of the reasons is because of the traditions of war, and certainly an officer or any kind of commander had never been seen to reload lying down or to crawl on the ground during battle, and they saw it as a lesser way of fighting. This gun absolutely overwhelmed the Austrians at Sadowa, and it resulted in massive death for the Austrian armies, an absolute slaughter. The video on the Austro-Prussian War, that's an 11-minute video that's linked in the Google Classroom underneath this PowerPoint presentation, is what you need to stop and watch now. So go ahead and do that. All right. So the Austro-Prussian War was over very quickly, and at Sadova, Bismarck really earned his reputation. He wrote to his wife and said, after Sadova, I really don't see us having the need to fight even another battle. All the rest of the battles were just addendums to the already concluded war. So let me read you something very quickly from on a newspaper writing on the reputation that Bismarck now had at the end of Sadova. There was nothing but fluttering flags and immense rejoicing, since news had spread of a new and decisive victory at Königgrätz. Prague is supposed to be in Prussian hands. If that were true, the newspaper has just arrived. Telegraphic dispatch by the King to the Queen dated July 3rd. Great triumph over the Austrians. All 8 corps under fire for 8 hours. Austrians completely defeated. Extent of trophies still cannot be estimated. Our losses are significant. We are all well. May God's grace continue to be with us. This represents an incredible mobilization of power. Since June 27th, there have been battles every day. Finally, this victory, which may essentially put an end to the conflict. The army has exhibited an excellence that has not been anticipated on either side. Even the much vaunted Austrian cavalry was beaten by the Prussian, one in every engagement. Bismarck is now the most popular man in Prussia. Everyone sings his praises, even the Democrats. I hope he manages to bring us a unified Germany. Besides that, there's howling and lamenting in most families. These victories were not easy. A whole lot of blood was shed. Our house has been flooded with sympathetic visitors from all classes. This certainly does it good, but, oh, Gerhardt, 3 beloved children are now gone. My Lord, dear God, how it hurts so bitterly, and the poor bride, who was always writing with such courageous letters, how dejected she will be. I cannot go on writing. You are all warmly embraced. So that's from a Prussian diary reflecting on the cost of the Austro-Prussian War. We don't want to discount it because it's a 7-week war and to say there were no losses. There were very, very heavy losses, especially on the Austrian side. But Bismarck did not want to continue to hurt Austria through a lot of punishment. So let's just look at these quick notes. He did not have the idea of crushing Austria or to upset the balance of power or to say, we want to make an Austria that can never rise again, because, of course, his goal is simply German unity. And so even though the Austrians had been dealt a very heavy blow and they could be considered no longer the great power that they once were, just from the sense of losing to the Prussians in a war that only took 7 weeks and 1 major battle, instead, Bismarck followed a certain pathway. Remember, he essentially wants to fight the war to unite Prussian nationalism, not to crush the Austrians. And so what does that look like exactly? Well, first of all, he asked the Austrians to pay no reparations for the war. Nothing was to be paid to Germany. Austria did not lose any territory to the Prussians. This was not a war fought over territory. This was a war fought over control and dominance in the German Confederation. Austria agrees to withdraw from what's called German affairs. So in other words, next time there's a Germanic territory dispute, Austria agrees, okay, we will stay out of this. And so, you read this here. Bismarck is the most popular man, even among the Democrats. What do they mean by that? Well, this quote from your text does a great job of explaining this. It says, Bismarck believed that because of the events of 1848, the German middle class could be led to prefer a national unity under conservative leadership than a long, uncertain battle for truly liberal institutions. Is that true? Could the Germans have their head turned by the chance for a united Germany and forego the liberal goals of voting rights, a constitution, a true Prussian parliament? And the answer here is yes. That's why Bismarck and the king were successful in what they were doing. So that's 1866, Austro-Prussian War. Bismarck does not move on. He's not doing a blitzkrieg. He doesn't say, well, who's the next area for defeat? But he does know that he needs to unite the Catholic and poor southern Germany with the rest of Prussia if we really want there to be a true Germany. And so how can we get that done? Well, one way is by goading the French into a war. This would allow the Germans to feel a feeling of nationalism against a longtime enemy. Germany and France have never been great friends. We've had Prussia as the sentinel on the Rhine for years. And at the end of this war, they're really not going to be friends. And so can you goad the French into fighting a war against the Prussians and having the South run into the arms of the Prussians in a nationalistic response? And the answer is yes. And that's what we call the Franco-Prussian War. Oh, by the way, I forgot to say this. Here is the, can you see this? Yeah. Here is a book on the Austro-Prussian War that you can get from Charles Rivet Editors. I think that you can get this one free as well. If you want to borrow this for your extra assignment that I'm going to want you guys to do over the next few weeks, you can just put a note in the inbox or send me an email and I'll mark this for you. It's a short book. It's, you know, let's see, not counting the, I would say it's about 40 pages, and it ends, if this interests you, it ends with a really great poem that someone wrote about Bismarck and how bad he was. So if you're interested in reading a poem about Bismarck, that's how the book concludes. So we're going to, though, now in 1870, we're going to find ourselves at war with the French. Now, I cannot really go into the details of how Bismarck goaded Napoleon III into declaring war on the Prussians, because Bismarck knew he had to get the French to act first, or he had to at least be able to claim that Prussia was acting in defense, because otherwise it's not really a patriotic war. It looks like it's just being provoked. They have to be the victims of attack. And so he's successful in getting Napoleon to do that. Now, this has to do, and when I'm saying Napoleon, I'm talking about Louis Napoleon. Remember, our friend, Louis Napoleon, Napoleon III. Now, to get into that is way too long. It has to do with the hereditary line in Spain that had been left open, and who was going to take the king there, the role of king there, and whether or not that king would have a German heritage. And the rulers of Europe, because of the balance of power, all had a traditional say in who would become the crowned kings of the lesser nations, which it by now includes Spain. There was basically a whole lot of double crossing, a whole lot of misread interpretations, and one doctored telegram that happened. And when that telegram got doctored by Bismarck himself, Napoleon III declared war on Prussia in 1870. And so the problem with Napoleon III is he feels that France is better prepared to fight the war than it is. He feels that France is more united than it is, and he feels he has more popularity than he does. And none of that was true. The Franco-Prussian War, except for the standoff that happened in Paris, also basically was ended by one battle, and this battle is called the Battle of Sedan, September 1st, 1870. This victory was a pretty intense victory for the Prussians. Now, the French were better fitted out with weapons, but by 1870, the things that they had purchased and that basically caught them up with where the Prussians were now outgunned by advances in the breech-loading needle gun. The breech loader had many advantages, but it did have the disadvantage of allowing hot gases to escape out of the breech, and so they burned the faces and the arms of men fighting with them. They had some accuracy issues, and so those things had been approved, and the Prussians had continued to adopt new technology. So even though the French had this technology, and they even had a couple of brand new weapons that were super secret. Guys, I gotta tell you, I know you want to watch the video, but if you read these books, they're really fun. I can't tell you all the information in them on a video because we'd be here for the rest of the year. But the French had a weapon that they had developed in case of a war like this. And basically, they kept the weapon so secret that nobody in France that was up in the military echelon had any directions of how the weapon was to be used. So they developed a weapon that was so super secret that no one knew where the instruction manuals were for using the weapon, and no one had ever been trained on the weapon. And so it had very little actual practical use. So you can read a little bit more if you're into the military history side of things about the Battle of Sedan and about the Franco-Prussian War itself and about the double crossing in this book, The Franco-Prussian War, again by Charles River Editors. And this one, I believe, too, is free if you have Amazon Prime or Kindle. I guess that's related, whatever. I don't really know. All I know is that I downloaded the Otto von Bismarck book for free. Pretty sure you can download these for free. There's only 4 of you. If you want this physical copy, send me an email and you can read this. This is a little bit longer, a little bit more of an investment than the Austro-Prussian War. But hey, that was only a 7-week war. This is a war that lasts a little bit more than a year. So the Battle of Sedan ends, and again, at this point, the French are completely and utterly humiliated. This was a super humiliating defeat for the French, and Napoleon III did not handle it well. He was basically asked to surrender his troops, and his answer was, well, I can't surrender them because I'm no longer the emperor. I have no power. I am a prisoner. He was taken prisoner by the Prussians and humiliated. His wife was back in Paris waiting to receive direction on where to take their son, who was, of course, remember now, heir to the throne, and what foreign country she should fly to, or should she come and try to rescue Napoleon III. The temperature in Paris was not good. There was a lot of unrest in Paris because socialism had really, really grown there. And socialism had never died out, but a lot of dissatisfaction with Napoleon III, a lot of dissatisfaction with broken promises, a lot of continued poverty, a lot of continued agitation by unions and international socialist movements had really made Paris a hotbed of radicalism. Now, that didn't mean that everyone in Paris was a radical, but certainly that's where the radicals were concentrated. And so what happens is that even though the battle is basically over, the socialists kind of hole up in Paris and they tried to put on a resistance in September of 1870 against the Austrians. There's amazing stories, guys, about the Austrians coming to Paris, and basically because the Parisians were trying to defend the city, the Austrians said, well, we'll just live in the area. They moved into the Palace of Versailles. Remember our old friend Madame Pompadour, that was the mistress of Louis XV? She had had her apartments completely covered in the finest of woods, and had basically installed this wood paneling all throughout her apartments. That winter, the Austrians went into what was Madame Pompadour's apartments in Versailles, in the palace, and pulled all the wood off the walls and burned it and used it for firewood. This was a humiliation to the French people, and yet they kept trying to fight. Let me read to you just one quick section, and then this will be the last thing that I read to you out of these books. But I do think it's helpful to take a look at these things. So, desperate to both send and receive news of the French's fate, the condition of the French armies, and a list of much needed supplies, the government used hot air balloons. 66 flights, some carrying homing pigeons able to fly undetected with the information, were sent successfully from Paris. On October 7th, 1870, Leon Gambetta, then serving as the embattled Minister of the Interior, left the city himself in a hot air balloon. His goals were to whip up defenders who would open a new front to the war in the Loire Valley, providing increased morale and pulling German forces away from the siege. He boarded to a great shout of "Vive la République! Vive Gambetta!" When the balloon got behind the line of the French forts, they became a mark for the rifles and cannon of the enemy, fortunately without result. Then the balloon manifested a tendency to descend in too close proximity to the Germans and was shot at again and almost hit. And then soon afterward, another ineffectual volley was discharged at it. Though Gambetta made it safely to Amiens, where he worked to continue the resistance, the news from Metz and the collapse of government in exile at Tours meant that his mission was futile. So things are so bad in Paris that the new socialist leader is hot air ballooning his way out of there. And the people of Paris are desperate. We're eating rats. We are under siege by the Austrians, and we're trying to hold out. It does not work. And by 1871, the Franco-Prussian War is over. Now, remember what we said. Von Bismarck's interested in German unity. He's not interested in territorial gains. But in this case, the French had really ticked everybody off. And on top of it, part of being a strong German nation is to make sure that the French don't rise again. And so the treatment of the French is going to be very different than the treatment of the Austrians. Let's look at that. So, result of the French Franco-Prussian War. The French would pay dearly for holding out against the Prussians. Number one, it's just in terms of humiliation. William I is proclaimed the Emperor of Germany in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. That is pretty tough to take. The place where the French once ruled with Louis XIV and the Sun King sitting in place now has the first ever German emperor crowned. Right in the face of France's powerful home to their own kings. And so that certainly was an emotional and morale humiliation. Second, what about the money? The French have to pay 5 billion francs to Germany for the efforts of the Austrian army in trying to control and be done with this Parisian commune. And by the way, the Prussians could just say, well, this war was started by the French, and so we have the right. Another thing that happens is the ceding of Alsace-Lorraine to the Germans. Now, it was a very, very rich area for farmland, for economic reasons, and the French feel extremely bitter about the fact that the Germans asked for this territory. And you're going to hear this come up again in World War I, because this is a long-standing issue of hatred between the French and the Germans. That leads us to our last point, poisoned relations between the Prussians and the Germans. Relations between the Prussians and the Germans were never great, but the Franco-Prussian War really puts a long-standing hatred and mistrust between these two countries. And so we are going to see that rise again in a later and important world war, maybe a couple of world wars, but certainly the Franco-Prussian War didn't end as the French would have liked it. And Napoleon III has had to resign and flee, and we're left with a very uncertain government situation. The French have by now declared another republic. They can't get a clear leader. They're going to kind of descend into a vacuum of leadership that we'll talk about in our next section on the responsive national state. And so we're going to end here, and hopefully this has been helpful to you in understanding the continuing saga of how nation states come to rise in Europe. We're going to talk very quickly about the Russians and the Turks. I probably will not take more than 10 minutes to do that at the beginning of the next video. And then we're going to go into a section called the responsive national state. Your text puts it as the responsive national state 1870 to 1914. What it's exploring is, okay, now that we have England, France, but also Italy, Germany, Austria, Russia, now that we have these modern nation states, how do they respond to various challenges that face them between 1871, between the time that Germany defeats the French, and 1914, when World War I begins? That's what we have to look forward to finish out this chapter 24. I'm going to do that in one more video and a reading exercise, so you will need your texts for another assignment this week. So I hope that this is understandable to you, that you've enjoyed it. I think I forgot to tell you to watch that Franco-Prussian War video. It's a 7-minute video. Make sure you watch it. Those will be helpful to you, give you some visuals and some help. And I will see you again soon. Thanks, guys.